plan.
Well, good morning. My name is Rick Kyte, director of the D.B. Reinhart Institute for Ethics and Leadership at Viterbo University, and we're trying something new, a series of conversations via Zoom on ethical issues that are facing our communities at this point in time. And our guest this morning is Dr. Jeff Thompson, who's a longtime pediatrician and former CEO of Gundersen Health Systems based here in La Crosse. And we're going to be talking about the issue of ventilators and ventilator allocation. Just this past week, the Ventilator Allocation Advisory Work Group out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison came out with a set of guidelines for the state. And this is something that many states are doing, is coming out with these guidelines because, of course, there's a real shortage of ventilators, especially in places where COVID-19 is reaching its peak in places like New York City. So I wanted to start out just asking you, Dr. Thompson, could you explain to us what a ventilator is and why it's so important at this point in time?
Sure. A ventilator is a very important piece of equipment for ill patients. It is basically an air pump. When the patient's either too weak to pull air into their lungs, or the lungs are so sick that the air cannot get in, a ventilator, with the help of a small, usually plastic tube that goes down through the windpipe, an endotracheal tube, the ventilator pushes air into the lungs so that you get that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So it's a mechanical assistance for you to breathe when either you're too weak or too sick or both to get the air in and the air out that needs to happen to stay alive.
And most hospitals don't have a lot of ventilators, I would guess, especially smaller hospitals might just have a couple. Is that right? Major hospitals in big cities would have more, but it's not a commonly used, or I mean, it's not used all the time, that piece of equipment.
Exactly. In a hospital that might have 50 beds, they might have 2 or 3 or 5 or 7. In a hospital with 300 beds, the ICU might only be 25 or 30 beds for adults. It could be 50, but still, there's far more beds without a ventilator than those are with. They're really reserved for the sickest of patients. The operating room, of course, has some special ventilators, but that's for short term while people are under anesthesia. The intensive care unit for babies has ventilators, but they're remarkably different than those for adults. And pediatrics is some mix. So it is not as common at all as hospital beds or the availability of rooms in a hospital. Much less more common.
Well, one of the I guess issues that I've been noticing that people talking about with this ventilator allocation guidelines in many states is the worry about the rationing of healthcare and healthcare services. And so, of course, rationing, to my understanding, is something that we do routinely in healthcare, right? And I want to kind of get your kind of insight into this as somebody who's been a healthcare administrator. So rationing isn't something that we do only in crisis, right? Isn't it something that we do all the time when we're making decisions about who gets what?
Well, yes. Unfortunately, rationing in this country will cause a lot of people to stand up and pound their chests and say, "Oh, well, we would never do such a thing in the United States." But of course, rationing, as you point out, is commonplace. We ration less transparently and less openly, but ration nonetheless. We have a more transparent system, for example, in the organ procurement for donated organs. There is a tiering of how sick the patient is, and that will result in where they get ranked. along the line, and some people much farther down who don't seem as stable, or they have many other conditions. They might not get ranked up there, might not get it. But the big rationing in this country has to do with the fact that we have limited access for people who are poor. We have insurance that's not available to everybody. And we have giant copays that affect people's decisions. Every study that's been done shows people choose not to get care here in a way that's much more common than in other developed countries because of their concern about the costs, and that happens on a regular basis. So we, in fact, ration care away from the poor and towards the well-off every single day in this country.
So I guess maybe what's unusual is that we're having a public discussion right now about rationing in a time where all of us are thinking it might be relevant to ourselves or our families in the near future, right?
Oh yes, this gets poignant pretty quickly. When you start saying you have a needed intervention that without it the person dies, and you quickly are running out of those resources, then you say, under what criteria should we decide? Who makes up the criteria? Who decides how you follow the criteria? It gets sticky really quickly. Is it young people who have many years to live, or old people who have contributed more to society? Is it people with other conditions that should not be allowed to be on the ventilator? Or should it just be who we think most likely is going to survive the ICU stay, or another year, or is it 5 years or 20 years? It gets pretty messy pretty quickly. And I mean, if you have people on ventilators and then other people show up that need them, who are more likely to be helped, you take some people off. I mean, it gets very complicated, very difficult. And this is why people like the folks from UW, other people around the country, articles published in the New England Journal, have been trying to address this as a more thoughtful, organized, and transparent process so that the public will have at least some feeling of engagement and fairness, even though there will be no system set up that everybody, especially in the heat of a dying relative, will feel is fair.
But, and that's interesting, you mentioned transparency, that that's in fact one of the recommendations that this working group has made, is that these guidelines, first of all, should be transparent, and that they should solicit community input about them. And I think that many of the recommendations are not really controversial at all. However, there are a few things that I found kind of interesting. I'd just like to get your feedback on. One is that there should be a triage team, either a triage officer or a triage team that is making these kind of immediate in-place decisions within each healthcare setting. Could you explain to us how that works? What actually goes on when these decisions get made on the ground?
Yeah, the push for a triage team is in the UW publications. It's in a number of other pretty common publications. The thinking is that there is so much stress by the clinicians, the doctors, the nurses, the respiratory therapists in the emergency department, in the intensive care units, that to have to pull a patient off a ventilator or decide between these two patients who they are working very hard to take care of is a burden that should be pulled back a notch for a couple reasons. One, it is very stressful on these folks. Two, we know that in the middle of all these stressful situations, from other studies on following protocols, and that individual clinicians have great variability in how closely they follow the guidelines. Some out of personal choice, some out of fatigue, there's a lot of reasons. If you're going to build public trust, if you're going to be as fair as you can to the broadest number of people, we have to have a consistent, thoughtful, and as we mentioned, transparent system to say, this is what healthcare is going to look like. For rich and poor, for black and white, for every religious denomination. This is not about, it is about these criteria and these criteria alone, and pulling it back a notch from the frontline providers to the triage, a triage team made up of clinicians, a nurse, someone that allocates resources, maybe an administrative person, so that they can understand the bigger picture and try and understand how the most people can be helped with the limited resources. And limited resources is something that people in the United States are not used to hearing. I mean, it's of course been limited for many, many people, part of our communities. I mean, why do African American women have a 5-time mortality in childbirth than white women? I mean, it's because of limited access. It's a lot of things, but we have a problem with thinking about limited resources. Now, I just have to interject here that one of the antidotes to this crisis of ventilators is being farther upstream and have better preparation, to have long-term thinking rather than short-term thinking. To jump around in the midst of a crisis is heroic. It's far better to have planning far ahead of time, to have systems set up, to have better testing, to have better systems of tracking patients who are positive, to have structures for both that as well as how we treat, isolate, and follow up on people. That is hard work. It's not as glorious work, but it is far better to do it that way than wait until we have a resource crisis and then have to be divvying up ventilators. I'm not saying everything can be prevented, but I can say a lot of things could be prevented, and we have a lot of models around the world where people prevented most of this limited resource allocation crisis.
So that brings up an interesting point, because I've noticed lots of times we talk about ethical decision making as controversial decisions that are made in response to some urgent situation. But we tend not to think of ethical decision making as something that goes into making sure that the crisis does not happen in the first place. So we don't think of preventive decision making as ethical decision making. It seems to me it should be, because oftentimes that's much more effective. I was just looking at some of the statistics on the effectiveness of ventilators, and it seems to range anywhere from, like Italy, I think the effectiveness was around 15% of people who went on ventilators were able to come off of them and recover. In New York City, Governor Cuomo said their experience is around 20%. Maybe in a best case scenario, it's closer to 30. These are people with COVID-19 who on ventilators. So even we're not talking about something that is really effective as a cure for COVID-19. It's really a last ditch effort.
Yeah, that's true, and the information is, of course, all over. It depends on the age of the population, depends on comorbidities, it depends on how early you get them in. Again, if you have a system that people are scared to come in to get tested, they're afraid of what might happen, all those kinds of things, you get people later and later and later, and more of them die. And some patients it isn't, there's just nothing you're going to be able to do to fix it. and they're going to die no matter what. I believe as we get better testing, as we have better systems of care, we get people earlier, that the survival rate will go up. But your point is still well taken. Once you get to that point, this is a very bad disease that causes enormous damage to the lungs and beyond the lungs. There's heart and other things that show up. And so it is a big problem, and it is very scary for families. And again, one of the big social implications of this, it is, I spent 35 years in newborn and pediatric intensive care. It is very scary for families to have a patient in an intensive care unit, ventilators, monitors, all that stuff. We have family rooms next door. We had big chairs where the family would stay in the room with the patient. All that not being there is not only terrible for the families to see their loved one go on a respirator and know more likely they're going to die than not, and more likely family members aren't going to be close, or at least a very limited number of them. It's also better for the patient to have family there. I mean, the studies have been shown, you have family members there that talk to the patients, that help them, encourage them, do those things. It is absolutely clear that the patients do better. So there are multiple layers of struggles here, and I feel very badly for the patients, for the families, and of course the healthcare workers who are doing great work trying to take care of patients and take care of themselves, because they have families, they have children, they have parents they take care of. I mean, it's pretty tough.
One final question I wanted to ask you. In the state of Wisconsin, I was just checking the Wisconsin Hospital Association dashboard. Wisconsin hospitals today have 1,246 ventilators, so that's the state supply. Today, 351 of them are in use. So around a third or so of the ventilators are in use. Governor of New York has been requesting that hospitals that have extra ventilators send them to New York.
Yes.
When does that become the right thing to do? If you've got say 30 ventilators in a local hospital that aren't being used at the time, but you don't know what the future holds in the next 2 weeks. So how do you make a decision whether to send them to a needed place, and do you get them back?
Yeah, sorry, we're out of time. I'll have to go. That's a terrific question, and that is a very hard point, because one of the things that healthcare has been noteworthy about over the years, as good as any industry I've ever seen, is that they share information, they share equipment, they share people. Even with fierce competitors across towns, across state lines, we share all kinds of things that in other businesses would be considered trade secrets. You never do. We share that information. We've sent equipment all over the place. We've sent donated organs to all over the states. It's just the way it's done in healthcare. This is so problematic for a couple reasons. One, it's very difficult to predict when your surge might come. We know it's not all at the same time. I mean, New York is hopefully coming down, but Massachusetts is still in trouble, and Louisiana is in a lot of trouble, and one of the hottest spots in the country just showed up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So it is important to realize that you don't have all that information, that you want to help. You don't know if you send them, you can get them back because of shipping and a lot of things. And frankly, you're nervous because a lot of your other supplies, masks and gowns and things that you ordered, that companies said you're getting, all of a sudden the FEMA or some other part of the federal government takes them. And you don't get what you know you would count it as having. The third piece, another piece here is that something that healthcare has learned from business over the years to try and manage costs is just-in-time supplies. So rather than having warehouses full of lots of supplies, many healthcare organizations have moved to smaller and smaller stockpiles so that they don't have all their money tied up in supplies, because the shipping routes have been good, the manufacturers have been good, the consistency of our supply chain has been so strong that people have not had warehouses and warehouses full of supplies, whether it's ventilators or masks or gowns or medicines or other things. So you start this with probably a smaller stockpiles than we would have had 10 or 15 years ago. We start with an unpredictable disease with variable peaks, and with a very transparent system of, you have an obligation, you've taken on as a CEO on the board for the health and well-being of your community. Well, if you give away half your ventilators and then you need them, that's a big problem. So what do I think? I think you have to sit, carefully look all this over, and as a state, as a region, say, how are we doing? Because it's more than just the state. I mean, if you know, Mayo and Gundersen have competed for a long time. If Rochester said we are in desperate need, we would help them. And if we said we're in desperate need, they would help us. I just know that that's the way we behaved all the way along. And I think what you do is you come up with a modified assistance, and we say, look, if we have 600 or 800 extra, we cannot ship all of them. But if we can ship 150 out of the state, so everybody gives up a small portion, and then Minnesota helps out, and Southern Illinois helps out, and Michigan, upper Michigan helps out, then I think you can come up with enough to help them through it. Because we certainly wouldn't want to be in their shoes, and so we want to help them get through it if we can. So that's a pretty long answer, but that's a very hard problem.
Well, thank you. I thank you for addressing that, because I think we're focusing all this attention on a few really crucial decisions about ventilator allocation, where you decide between one person and the next. But the bigger decisions are these resource kind of distribution questions, because if we have more ventilators, then you make fewer of these immediate decisions weighing the life of one person against the next. And it seems to me that that's where the bigger burden of ethical decision making comes in, is in these larger kind of resource allocation decisions.
Oh, it's really true. And it starts early on with a mindset. Do we have a mindset of collaborative efforts to make it work for the best of the most people? Or do we have a scarcity mindset that we're going to hunker down, protect our own? And I would argue that most healthcare institutions, most organizations, civic organizations, their foundation is built far more on the collaborative. We're going to figure out how to broadly help the most people, regardless of what county or city or state they live in, where they came from, what their religious aspects, what their race. I mean, you have to broaden, I would argue, you broaden the tent. You don't look at it from scarcity. You look at it from a collaborative effort to do the most good for the most people. And you have a broad tent to help you make decisions on that. No one person makes these decisions. And so we have a broad tent, we do that, and we look at it from, we have enormous resources. And if we distribute them well, in a thoughtful fashion, transparently and openly, then we should be able to do the most good for the most people.
Well, thank you very much. That we're running out of time here, and so I think that's a good note to conclude on. And thank you for shedding some light on what's becoming I think, pretty controversial topic, but also a very complex one. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. Anytime. Nice to talk with you. It is a very difficult problem, and I appreciate that you're willing to to take a little time to talk about it. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
You're welcome. See you.